Welcome to Drinking on the Edge. I'm David Fuhr. My sole guest is Andrew Jefford, who is the author of a great number of things, but we're here today to focus upon his book called Whiskey Island. Andrew, welcome to Drinking on the Edge. You've resided with your family in France for a good number of years. Andrew just informed me that they've all acquired French citizenship. Congratulations.
Thanks. We're really pleased and proud of that. Yes, we've lived here in France since 2010. And under previous pre-Brexit arrangements, we had every right to live in France for as long as we wanted as British citizens. Once Brexit happened, that was no longer true. An enormous political and economic catastrophe befell my native country. And in response to that, living in France, the only sensible thing to do is to acquire joint French citizenship, Anglo-French citizenship.
Andrew, he writes about spirits, and whiskeys in particular, I think, in France, but he's better known, and I'd say widely known, for his writings about wine. And if you want for reference, please go to andrewjefford.com. That's AndrewJefford.com. And of course, he's got a pretty nice Wikipedia page as well. So dive into those for references. He's an author of many things, again, mostly of wine. And he's also a longtime contributor to the well-known Britain's Decanter magazine. In regards to what we're talking about today, for those of you expecting a well-trodden, narrow trot through distilleries and their products, when looking at Whiskey Island, it's best to ready yourself for a 400-plus page ramble through the culture, history, personalities, both rotting and very much alive, descriptions of its land and landscape, sea and seascapes, deeply dug chapter on peat, that's P-E-A-T, naturally one on weather and another unexpectedly about shipwrecks, and prodigious distillery fact files for all you whiskey geeks. And they're all arranged to lure you in and hopefully to the uniqueness that's Islay. It really is as much a very personal, sometimes poetic travelogue as it is a look into Islay's whiskeys. And a little bit more of a preamble. I read the original version of Whiskey Island entitled Peat, Smoke, and Spirit back, I think it was published 2004. Is that correct, Andrew?
Correct.
And soon after I read it, I hightailed it up to Islay. Fortunately, it wasn't too far. I was living in London at the time. And I attended that year's annual, correct my pronunciation, Fèis Ìle?
Yeah, that'll do.
Used to be it was a music and malt and music festival, and now it's just Fèis Ìle. And Andrew, before I keep blathering on, your first visit to Islay well preceded mine. It was 1993, was it?
March 1993, almost exactly to the day.
Fantastic. So what motivated you to, 32 years ago, venture to this somewhat lonely locale?
A lot of the appeal was that it was just so damn lonely, and I've always loved lonely places. Actually, my first ever glimpse of Islay was from the neighboring island of Jura. I happened to visit Jura before I ever visited Islay. But Jura is a very difficult place to get to, and for various reasons, we'd arrived there by helicopter. And actually, it was a beautiful evening, and I remember looking across the sound of Jura to Islay, across that wonderful seaway with its enormous riptide rushing through it, across to the distilleries of Fèis Ìle, Haven, and nowadays as well. And it was just a most magnificent view, and I just felt I had to get back there as soon as I can. Fortunately, at that time, I was writing every week in the Evening Standard, the London newspaper, back in the days when it was a newspaper. And they allowed me to cover all of drink, not just wine. That's always been a big enthusiasm of mine. I've never really understood the kind of narrow focus on one subject to the exclusion of all others. And to me, if you love beautiful alcoholic beverages, they all make sense. They're all beautiful. They all have different sorts of beauty. I love comparing them and contrasting them and seeing what they all have to offer. So I had the chance to then go to Islay and begin to discover its whiskies and the island itself. I remember the day I was actually meant to go, something happened, which quite often happens on Islay. If you're trying to get there by aeroplane, a storm blows in and you can't get there. In fact, we flew most of the way there, and then the pilot said, "I'm sorry, it's just too wild. We're going to have to go all the way back." So my first night on Islay didn't happen. We flew back to Glasgow, but I got there the next day. And I remember going to visit Lefroy with the then distillery manager, Ian Henderson. And he told me with some pride that they'd been collecting seaweed from the gutters of the distillery that morning. That gave you some indication of how wild a night it had been. But it was also a sad moment on Islay, 1993, because only 4 of the 7 distilleries were actually working at that time. And I went with Ian to the next door distillery of Ardbeg, which was in the same ownership at the time. And it was cold, silent, damp, forlorn, very sad place. And I remember Ian saying to me, really what we should do is tear it down. That would be the best thing for our brand, Lefroy, because somebody's going to buy this one day and then it'll be competition to us. Happily, they didn't tear it down. And now it's in the best of hands with LVMH, and it's flying and thriving. And by the time I came to write the book, of course, that transition was well underway. So it was a sort of precious time to be able to write the book. I began writing it in 2002, 2001, 2002, eventually published in 2004. And it was a time of exciting transition on Islay. The whole thing was coming back. Suddenly there was an enthusiasm from the market. People were discovering peaty whiskey. People were coming to discover the island. And I feel very fortunate to have had the chance to write that particular sort of book that I wanted to write, very much a portrait of the place and a portrait of the whiskies as part of the place at that moment. Pretty exciting to do it now because a lot's happened since, but it was a particularly exciting moment because many things were coming back from the dead at that point.
The midges notwithstanding, can you share with our listeners what is once you've dropped down onto it?
Where should we begin? Scotland, a nation of islands. It's a nation of islands. It has over 790 defined islands rather than rocks. And I think 94 of those are inhabited. So Scotland's a nation of islands. Islay is one of the most significant. It's the 8th largest island in the British Isles and the 5th largest island in Scotland. The calculations of miles will have to be done by most of the listeners, but 600 square kilometers. It's quite big. 40 kilometers north to south, 24 east to west. And if you were to drive from Ardbeg, which is right up one end of the island, all the way to Kilcoman, the farm distillery right on the Rins at the other side of the island, that is quite a substantial journey, not to be undertaken lightly. But for those people listening who already know perhaps islands like Skye, a very famous island to go and visit in Scotland, it's rather different to that. It was always called the Queen of the Hebrides. The reason for that was because it had the best farming land of any of the large islands. And because it was a farming island, because it was cultivable, it was also actually very thickly populated at certain points, overpopulated indeed. There was a lot of misery and poverty as a consequence. And it always had other resources too, lots of peat to be cut for fuel, lots of water, much easier topography than you see on Skye.
And as I recall, it was and might still be a net exporter of beef from cattle.
Yes, it does a lot of cattle finishing. Cattle can actually spend the whole of the year outside on Islay. They don't have to be inside at any time. And that's also an interesting part of the web of natural life on Islay because they have some very famous birds there called choughs. The reason the choughs can be there is because they like to dig about in cowpats. And there are always plenty of cowpats year-round for them to dig about in. That's one of the things about the island. Yes, a very significant and prosperous island, but nonetheless, never particularly easy to get to. I say that, of course, because we all think nowadays about ease of getting to places via car, driving along a road. But when you go back 1,000 years in Scotland, the motorways were all seaways. That was the easiest and quickest way to get anywhere. And actually, it wasn't terribly difficult to get from Glasgow to Islay by sea. Back in the days when most goods were traveling on the ocean, traveling on the waves, Islay was not actually that difficult to get to either. And that also helped make it of economic significance.
It's not too far a sail from the Mulligan-Tyre.
No, and it's as the crow flies, or as the raven flaps, or as the chuff tumbles through the air. It's not actually that far from Glasgow. The flight only takes half an hour at the most.
I recall that's how I dropped and left in 2004. And unfortunately, my schedule was too tight for me to take the ferry, though I truly wanted to. Yes, it was a bit rough ascending onto the tarmac, and I did remember, though, seeing some people golfing in the wind as we approached. It's a
very famous links golf course. And yes, the weather at the airport is quite treacherous, and it was one of the places where Nowadays, King Charles, back then Prince Charles, once an aviator in his prime, took the controls of the aeroplane he was on in order to land it and ended up off the runway with the aeroplane stuck for several days. So he probably remembers Islay quite well too.
Now, the book that you published previous to that of Pete, Smoke and Spirit was The New France, and you did quite well with that book, establishing yourself as an author of wine books of some note. And it all been obviously about French wine. You know, why this diversion into a relatively unknown category of whiskeys?
Good question. When you tell people you write about wine for a living, they say, oh, wow, that must be fantastic. You mean you go to Burgundy, you go to Bordeaux, you go to the Rhine Valley, you go here, there, and everywhere, following vineyards and all the rest. And that's true, and it's wonderful. But I can say this to you in all honesty, David, the most moving and the most romantic place that I ever went in the course of my career thus far was Islay. I love remote landscapes. I love lonely places. Perhaps Canada's a bit like it. Perhaps Scandinavia's a bit like it. I haven't traveled extensively in either. But it is a very beautiful landscape, but it really captured me. And I just wanted an excuse to keep going back there quite regularly, probably more regularly than I could justify as the wine writer for the Evening Standard. So the best excuse I could think of, and that it doubled as an excuse to be exceptionally nosy when I got there and asked people lots of questions, was to try and write a book about it. And nobody had ever written a book about it. So I thought, what the hell, let's give it a go. As I was writing it, I discovered that there were so many interesting stories to tell about the place. That was fantastic. Islay had fitted into the 20th century history in both world wars, via shipwrecks, and it had an awful lot of story to tell. So that was fascinating. And I would also say that it also made me think about what place can mean for drinks. Obviously, we had the notion of terroir in wine. I was curious to pursue that as far as it could be pursued into whiskey. And then the final reason for doing it was that I read a lot about whiskey. Michael Jackson, I knew Michael Jackson well.
Mm-hmm.
He was a good friend, read all his books, did some work of my own. And I realized that actually we wrote about lots of things when we described distilleries, but we didn't really understand them. And what I really wanted to do was to try and understand the whole process of distillation and try and get to the bottom of how it is that, or where aroma and flavor is principally created during the whole process of whiskey creation. So there were also some sort of professional challenges to be met there as well, over and above the sheer joy and pleasure of describing this extraordinary place on earth.
You mentioned terroir as being attached to wine, but also perhaps spirits. So this is an ephemeral concept. What's Islay's terroir? How would you describe it concisely to someone who's either a whiskey lover or someone who's completely ignorant?
It's a French term, terroir. That's the French pronunciation. We can all see the etymology of the word to do with terre, la terre, the earth, terra, all those words that we're very familiar with, terrestrial and so on into English. And it really means that the sense that a particular product of a place owes some percentage of its aroma and flavor profile to its physical origins, to the place it came from. In wine terms, to the soil, perhaps the subsoil geology, certainly the topography, the slopes, the angles that they're facing, also the climate, the weather pattern throughout the year, and of course with wine, also the particular weather pattern of a season, the vintage. All of those would be terroir factors until some human being arrives, some woman or man arrives and plants a vineyard. Terroir doesn't exist, it's silent. Burgundy, thought to be the greatest nuanced terroirs in the world, was all forest once, and there wasn't much terroir back then. So human beings are also an important part of terroir. That human intervention aspect is also a part of terroir. Now we go to whiskey, and let's say, what could be the way in which terroir could most clearly imprint itself on a whiskey? The answer to that is, it would be by doing everything as locally as possible. In other words, you should grow your own grain on your own farm. You should cut your own peat from your own farm as well. You should use that peat to dry. You should have your own maltings that you run on your farm. You'd use peat as the heat source to finish the malting process off. You'd then grind it up and make your mash. You'll use your mash and make your beer on the premises, perhaps ideally with wild yeast, although nobody's ever done that as far as I know. And then, of course, you should distill your spirit in situ, and then you should age it 100% in situ as well. That would be the maximum terroir imprint you could put onto a whiskey or a spirit.
No doubt from steel, metals of which you've mined from the earth yourself and smelted into steel and fashioned it into a tank.
Well, yes,
a tank, yes.
Exactly. However, when we actually begin to compare whiskey production closely with wine production, we discover that there are some enormous differences. The first difference is that grain is not grapes. They're two different things. Grain is a cereal crop. Grapes are a fruit. When you make wine, you literally pick the fruit, you take it back to the winery, and that is what you use to make it. It's not that simple, of course, with whiskey distilling. First of all, you have to acquire your grain. And of course, in most cases, for most distilleries, the grain is not coming from a farm by any means. It's coming from somewhere, usually quite a long way away. Sometimes there is a case made for certain varieties of barley, but never very convincingly, in my opinion. And most malt distilleries they're buying their barley type, their barley variety for efficiency above all. Essentially, your aim in whiskey distilling is always to produce a consistent product. And you're going to do it via a series of fairly dramatic interventions. First of all, you're going to malt the grain because the starch that the grain contains is no use at all for fermentation. It has to be malted first. So you're going to malt it. That transformation is one that you're going to undergo. You then have to dry the malt and grind it up and turn it into your grist. And obviously, one way in which you can do that is with peat, but you don't have to use peat if you don't want to. You can do it with a neutral heat source if you want. So that is essentially a kind of recipe decision, if you like. You have to add an awful lot of water. That's not something that's inside the product from the beginning, as juice is inside a grape. That's an external, it's going to come from the outside. Most people are using a neutral yeast for efficiency. There's no sense of indigenous yeast being significant in the way in which it is in the wine world. And then you're going to do this very complicated, very dramatic thing, which is pot still distillation, double distillation. And what I discovered in writing the book and comparing everybody's distillation methods and their equipment and all the rest is that this is an enormously significant element of the whole production process in terms of flavor creation. But it is, for sure, craft. It's nothing to do with the place. In order to do that effectively, you're going to design the still, you're going to take craftsmanship in design, and then you're going to need craftsmanship in operation as well. So those are operational factors, nothing to do with the place itself. And then finally, the third dramatic flavor input into any whiskey is what you age it in. And all spirit needs long aging, much longer than wine. You can't bottle new make spirit and expect people to enjoy the experience of drinking it. And so it has to be aged, and really it has to be aged for substantial periods.
So what is it that matters for the creation of an aroma and flavor, specifically in regards to Islay malt whiskey? We've touched upon a great number of processes here, and we've talked about where Islay is in the place of the world of whiskeys, but can you perhaps define a little bit to what Islay is unto itself, and perhaps by comparison to other malt whiskey categories?
Sure. If you ask most whiskey drinkers what Islay means in terms of aroma and flavor, they're going to say one word, a one-syllable word that begins with P and ends with T, and it's peat. And that is, Islay is synonymous with peaty whiskey. For very sound historical reasons, it was the coal of the country, to use a phrase that Mike Village in his excellent book on peat uses. It was the fuel of the place, of course. And most Islay distilleries had farm distilling origins, most of the big ones. And most of them eventually became legal distilleries, but they began life as illicit stills up on the hill, the black pot up on the hill. And they would certainly have been using peat to make the whiskey. So there has always been a tradition of using peat on Islay. But of course, then look at distilleries like Bunnahabhain or Bruichladdich. Now, they both produce peaty whiskey nowadays, but they made their name with non-peaty whiskey. They were originally unpeated whiskies. So are they any the less Islay? Bruichladdich goes to enormous lengths to try and do as much as it possibly can on the island. That was always its USP. And if you do all of that, but you happen to be using unpeated malt, is it any the less Islay? So you see the problem. The moment you try and find a sort of place, the stamp of place, and the most obvious one would be the use of peat, it begins to break down because it's a recipe decision. Even on Islay, it is a recipe decision. Nowadays, you don't have to use peat.
No.
It's a choice.
And as you pointed out in the book as well, it's an element that I learned long ago from distillers of various types, and that is the water that is used doesn't necessarily impart an aromatic character into the final product. That is, that water that is used in the mashing of the grain, the malts, the water doesn't matter all that much because it gets distilled out for the most part. And so the peaty waters that exist in various quantities throughout Islay, and I would argue other parts of Scotland, don't necessarily play a factor. It's the exposure to peat smoke that the malts receive in their maltings, if they do at all. That makes the difference in terms of the peaty factor that's going to come into play in the finished product. Is that correct?
100% correct. In fact, I remember just how shocked I was when I first visited Lagavulin and spoke to the distillery manager there. Back then, I believed all the distillery promotional videos, which lovingly linger on the stream tumbling off down from the loch, down into the distillery. And all this emphasis on wild water. And the distillery manager said, "Oh, it's such a pain. I'd plug it into the mains if I could. If there was any mains to plug it into on Islay. There isn't, at least in the quantity required for those distilleries." And I remember talking to the technical guys at Diageo, and they said, "I was unwilling to accept this myself, because when you actually sip a glass of peaty Islay water, it's not that it's peaty, but it's definitely soft and it is slightly vegetable." And my thinking was that wherever there is flavor, wherever there is aroma, it must leave some trace or other. And we chatted and they said, yes, maybe I finally got them to agree to maybe it might be 1%. But I couldn't get them any much further beyond 1%. And I got the feeling also that they were rather indulging me. Yes, I have to say, scientifically speaking, what you're saying is absolutely true. Despite all the promotional videos, despite a lot of the bullshit myth about Scotch, what you want is good quality water, because you don't want compromised water in any way. After that, it pretty much anything goes. And of course, it's very soft on Islay because it's fallen out of the sky. But there are other distilleries which use hard water, and they distill very effectively too, famously. Yeah, water is, and as you say, it's all going to be thrown away in the end. You use it for the brewing, and then you gradually throw it away in the distilling, and it's going to go down into the drain. And what you're collecting is the product of the malted starch as fermented, as distilled into a higher strength final incarnation.
I remember the one time I was there enjoying the best scallops I'd had before or since that I was told by the proprietor of the restaurant were pulled out of Lagavulin Bay. And then when I checked with the folks at Lagavulin, what's going on there, and they said, oh, our effluents, mind you, this is back in 2004 before EU regulations maybe got their hold, that the effluents was piped out about 200 meters out into the Lagavulin Bay from Lagavulin Distillery. And that's where the fish, they said our best fishing situations are from there. And that's the scallops that come from there. Again, not before or since have I had scallops that amazingly delicious.
It may not perhaps belong there, but it is nutrition going into the water.
I'm sure the fish were quite happy. Oh, we did make mention to a handful of distilleries. Just for the benefit of the listeners, can we recite them all? You don't have to do it alphabetically. I believe we'd mentioned already Laphroaig, Bruichladdich, Fèis Ìle, Hammoud.
Starting with the smallest, which is Bruichladdich. That's 1.5 million litres. Then Bumor, actually, is the next smallest, 1.7 million litres a year. And then comes Lagavulin, 2.5. And then Ardbeg, 2.8. Used to be smaller, but it's been much expanded in recent years. And then Laphroaig, 3.4. Ditto, and they've got more expansion plans underway. Bunnahabhain 3.5. People often tend to forget just how big Bunnahabhain is. And then you have the monster over next to the Sound, Fèis Ìle, 6.5 million hectolitres. Sorry, million litres, not hectolitres. That's my wine background creeping in. Million litres a year. All of those were million litres. If I mistakenly said hectolitres, apologies. They're all million litres. So those are the big ones. And then they've been joined. Actually, it's quite exciting. We've had Kilcoman Farm Distillery since 2005. That was almost ready when the book came out, but not quite. Then there's been a bit of a jump to Ardnahoe Distillery in 2019. That's in between Fèis Ìle and Bunnahabhain. Kilcoman, by the way, is out on the Rhin, so way out west on Islay. It is the most westerly of all the distilleries, and as a consequence gets the worst weather of all. A heroic undertaking to farm out there. Kilcoman, Ardnahoe, and then of course Port Ellen has been rebuilt by Diageo, and that reopened this time last year in March 24. And then you have another 4 on the way.
Really?
Yeah, there's Port and Trewin, Port Ellen. I believe that's not far off opening. It was scheduled to be opened last year. I didn't think it did, but perhaps this year we'll see it. And then you have Lagan Bay Distillery. That's a project between Ian MacLeod Distillers and the Islay Boys, brewers on Islay. You have Gartbreck Farm Distillery, which was a project that's been underway since 2014, but ran into a lot of problems. And now, rather excitingly, has been picked up by Pernod Ricard, and they are going to get involved in that. And I say excitingly because 55% of the whole whiskey business is 2 companies. One is Diageo, and they're already very well established on Islay. The other is Pernod Ricard, and they don't have an Islay distillery at this stage. So eventually, I'm sure that'll be a really exciting project. And then finally, there's a tiny little farm distillery project, again down on the Rhin, called Islay Distillery. That's a Gerach farm down on the Rhin. A very small, circular, minute farm distillery planned for there as well. Eventually, there's going to be 14 distilleries on Islay once all of those are up and running.
Wow, that's double the number as there was 20 years ago.
7 large ones that I write about in the book, and that each have a chapter of their own in the book, will still be easily the most significant distilleries on Islay. No. And I should say also, David, the other thing, and I didn't realize this when I was planning the book, but of course a huge difference between writing wine books and writing whiskey books is that in a distillery, nothing ever changes. That's the whole point. Once you build your distillery and once it has its reputation and everybody knows that it makes beautiful spirit, the one thing you never want to do is change anything. You must keep everything exactly the same. For example, when Ardbeg was much expanded, they'll be very careful about making sure that everything that they do, all the new stills they create and the new spirit that's going to run off them is exactly like the old spirit. So one advantage of writing a book about whiskey distilleries is that in principle, of course, the expressions change and the releases and the marketing and all of that. But in principle, and the whiskey character itself, the distillery character, yes, you'll play about with oak aging, and yes, you'll play about with peating. But the actual distillery character, the thing that you're creating during your double distillation processes, is fundamentally not going to change. And just one other thing to add there, 90% of Scotch, even today, is blended Scotch. So the big market for every malt distillery in Scotland is the blending trade. And that's true on Islay, evidently true for Fèis Ìle, where almost all of this colossal quantity of spirit will go into the blending trade. But also true for all of the others to a greater or lesser extent, probably a small extent with Lagavulin, where the single malt is much followed, and it's not a huge distillery. Probably not a very large extent with Bulmore or Bruichladdich either, but all of the distilleries will have a certain percentage of their production going into the blending trade. And of course, the customers for blended whiskey want to have a spirit that they know exactly the same as it's always been. They don't want surprises.
Certainly more so than the followers of malt whiskeys to be. So in your 2019 edition of the book, you maintain that as much as 60% of Laphroaig's production gets sold off for blending purposes elsewhere. Now, presuming the data you have from 6 years ago is still accurate, that seems like a lot for a malt whiskey that is held in such high regard and is not cheap to buy.
But I just go back to that fundamental statistic that if you look at the whiskey, the sales of whiskey around the world as a whole, yes, us geeks care an awful lot about malt whiskey. And when we talk about malt whiskey, it's malts that we're generally going to talk about. But whiskey is still 90% blended whiskey. So there's a huge requirement to have top quality, top dressing malts in your blend, because they will really do, some Lefroy in a blend will do an awful lot of work.
A little Lefroy will go a long way, to be sure.
So that there will always be a huge demand for these highly characterful, top quality malts, such as all of the Islay malt.
You mentioned earlier,
for blending purposes.
You referred earlier to the geographic locations of the various distilleries, and why do you reckon it is that Ardnahoe, Fèis Ìle, Bunnahabhain, located in the northeast of the island, and the three southern clump, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, and Lefroy, those three distilleries are assembled so near one another in the south. Is there any reason, or historical or otherwise, for these clumping of distilleries?
Yes. Every single distillery on Islay, of the 7 historic distilleries, it's all absolutely to do with the water source. It's where you have, on a nice ledge up above the place where you have your distillery, so it can come down by gravity, you have a beautiful loch, which even in August will carry on giving you distilling water year round. The oldest distillery on Islay is Beaumont. That dates back to 1779. So in other words, it was licensed relatively early, but that was because it was in the main settlement on the island.
True.
It wasn't hidden away in a glen somewhere that nobody could see it or get at it. In a way, Beaumont is the least obvious of all of the 7 because it has the trickiest water source. It has a loch water source, but it's quite a long way away, and there isn't a huge gradient between the loch and the actual distillery. The course of the Lade, the brook that goes from the loch right the way down to the distillery, had to be worked out by a tailor using waxed thread to follow how the drips drip down the waxed thread and therefore show how gravity was most efficiently proceeding for the course of the Lade. And sometimes there have been problems with Beaumont's water source drying up. That's the least obvious, but it's also the oldest established in terms of transport, getting spirit on and off the island. It would have been the easiest to service, to take the whiskey away from, because always many boats were coming to and from Beaumont.
So why do you...
and then the others, you mentioned the 3 Kidalton distilleries, Ardbeg, Lefroy, and Lagavulin, and they all had their origin in wild, illicit distilling. And they were all, the first excise officer arrived on Islay, I believe in 1799. And sure enough, they were all licensed in the early 1800s. Ardbeg and Lefroy both in 1815, and Lagavulin in 1817. So that they were all clearly illicit distilleries, very successful illicit distilleries with lovely water sources that had to face the excise man at a certain point and then became legal after that point. And then the others, Bunnahabhain and Bruichladdich and Fèis Ìle. Fèis Ìle, I believe, was slightly later than the others. I'd need to check that out. I can't remember the exact date of founding. But they were all in different places. Bruichladdich, actually, and Bunnahabhain, there's another interesting story there. They both have a similar date of founding in the 1880s. Have a guess why that was? The answer is, of course, that there was a huge boom in the creation of whiskey distilleries in the 1880s because of phylloxera in the wine world. Phylloxera was cutting its way through France and Italy and Spain, and it looked like European wine was finished. Well, the whiskey distillers all thought, wow, we have a fantastic opportunity. The future's bright. Let's get building those distilleries. So they began looking for new places to put distilleries.
And eventually that would have affected the brandy production as well. That was so popular, too, in France.
But brandy required wine.
A few years down the road, yes, exactly.
Brandy was affected badly as well. So it really was the golden moment for Scotch whiskey.
That's
because
right.
they just needed grain and there was no phylloxera problem with grain.
There you go.
Those 2 distilleries were founded then. And in fact, Bunnahabhain, from the point of its founding in the 1880s until, I believe, the 1950s, was only accessible by sea. Never accessible by road until relatively mid part of the 20th century. It just goes back to what we were saying about historically, the main roads through the Highlands and Islands have been sea roads. And then Fèis Ìle, ditto. Fèis Ìle's slightly tricky because it has the Sound racing by, so not a terribly easy place to park your boat.
I was told when I was there by Mr. Stitchell, former manager of the operation, that it was not uncommon to see herds of deer swimming their way across between Jura and Islay across the Sound. They were more able to make the crossing than ships quite easily, I was told. So do you believe that the positioning of Islay, say, just outside of Glasgow to its west, and it being, shall we say, founded in illicit production, shall we say, or unlicensed production before the beginning of the 19th century, do you think what made it a disproportionately significant, important area for whiskey production, is it a location thing that had a lot to do with it? As well, it's being that much closer to Ireland, where we're told that whiskey production began before coming to Scotland?
There's really two separate questions there. Mm-hmm. The initial arrival of whiskey, the beginning of Scotch, as it were, the birth of Scotch, we speculate. The earliest reference to whiskey in Scotland is from 1494. It's from the Exchequer Rolls, the tax records of the day, and it records 8 bowls of malt to Friar John Core, wherewith, lovely Scottish word, wherewith, to make aquavitae. And that was about 500 kilograms of malt, but it was at Lindores Abbey on the Tay near Perth, over in eastern Scotland, so nowhere near Islay at all.
Okay.
The earliest reference in Ireland was 90 years earlier, 1405, from the annals of Clonmacnoise, records a clan head having died, having taken a surfeit of aquavitae. Those are the first two references. But we're almost certain that distillation went back a lot further, because we know that distillation in the Mediterranean area actually predated back in the pre-Christian era. Aristotle mentions distilling, boiling seawater to obtain drinking water. The word comes from Latin, means to drip or trickle down. And then the words alcohol itself and alembic both come from the Arab world, Arab science. Al-ambik was the still, and alcohol comes from al-kol, because the Arabs were often using distillation for medicinal and cosmetic purposes. And kol was the black powder used for eye makeup. Both those came from Arab words. It's thought that the art of distillation went from the Mediterranean to Ireland, translated by monks. Obviously, monks, the one big multinational back in those days was the Christian church, and monks had a duty to go out and convert people wherever possible. So they used to travel around a lot. There would have been Irish monks traveling from the Mediterranean up to Ireland.
Oh, sure.
And they would probably have brought the technology there. And it's logical, therefore, if it came from Ireland, that it would have gone to Scotland through the west. And it's not terribly far from about 20 miles from Antrim to Islay. Not quite the closest spot to Ireland. That would be the Mull of Kintyre and the Mull of Galloway as well. It's a little bit closer. But anyway, whiskey probably came across to Scotland via that route. But it is all speculative. We don't know that for sure. As to your second question,
please,
the fact that this island is the whiskey island par excellence, it has these 7 colossal distilleries. Now it has another 7 en route, smaller distilleries. Is that due to historical reasons? And I think, yes, it is due to historical reasons, because these were all very successful early legalized distilleries. So they would have been significant in the blending trade by the beginning of the 20th century, for sure. There would have been blending references at that point already. These would have been fine chopped dressing malt salt by blenders. Remember, we had grain whiskey from midpoint in the 19th century, so blended whiskey already existed for quite a long time by then. And once you have a great ingredient, you don't want to lose it. Even though this was, once the primary advent of road transport came about, it's quite an awkward place, and it's certainly an expensive place to do your distilling. The quality and the reputation of these distilleries is such, for historical reasons, that even though some of them went silent sometimes, they weren't actually. Port Ellen was pulled down, of course, but now it's been rebuilt. And then the others were never in the end pulled down, and now they're up and thriving. So yes, I think the history is a large part of why we still have this significant presence of distilleries on Islay.
And that said, let's drink some whiskey. Andrew and I have overlapping samples graciously provided us by the producers themselves, and believe Andrew's got something from his own cellar to share as well. But we don't have exactly the same things to taste as we often do at Drinking on the Edge, but we'll do our best. Andrew knows what I have, and I'm going to let him take the lead here. So what should we start with, Andrew?
We have two distilleries that both begin with A, I think. We have Ardbeg and we have Ardnahoe. Great to have some samples from Ardnahoe. So why don't we start with Ardnahoe, I think, because the peating of the Ardnahoe varies quite a lot. I think they say it's between 4 and 40 parts per million phenols in the new spirit. Remember, it diminishes a lot as you age, but that's the new spirit content. So why don't we have a look at the 5-year-old? Have you got that? Or got that?
My Ardnahoe are still en route. This is all for you to bring up. I can tell you, though, to the best of my knowledge, Ardnahoe is currently only available for retail sale in the UK. I don't know if it's available elsewhere, so if you want it, you got to be there or go there. That said, the folks at Ardnahoe have managed to get this off to Andrew in time for him to comment upon it.
I've got two Ardnahoe whiskies. One is the 5-year-old, and then the other is the one they call Boisa. That's the name of some caves near Ardnahoe. The 5-year-old is aged in Oloroso and bourbon cask. And the Bolsa, I said Boisa, Bolsa, is a predominantly Oloroso cask. And I have to say, for very young spirits, they're pretty impressive. Young spirit can be a bit of a challenge. It can be a bit wild and savage. But the distillation has been beautifully done here. The 5-year-old, it has some lovely kind of earthy, peppery, angelic. I would guess it's a little less peaty than the other spirit, if I had to make a guess. Quite creamy, but very much Islay in the terms of dimensions of its notes, that you're getting a lot in the glass when you sniff it.
And I believe
Ardnahoe, a bit of water.
Ardnahoe is an independent operation. They're not tied to a multinational, or am I incorrect?
You're absolutely correct. It's the Lane family, Hunter Lane. And it's a family-owned business. And I have to say, I haven't actually visited myself, but seen the pictures, and it's a most beautiful sight. Magnificent view of the Paps of Jura from the distillery.
I read somewhere, maybe it was in your book, that Mark Rainier, formerly of Bruichladdich, has a hand in this did have a hand in this at some time.
Okay, I don't know about that. That's news to me.
Okay.
If it's recent, it might be in the early days. I don't know. It might be pre-Waterford. I'm not sure. Anyway,
yeah, I think it may have been early days, and then he stepped away.
What is for sure is that the great Islay distiller Jim McEwen, good friend Jim.
Oh yeah,
who was the great distiller at Beaumont for many years, then was the great distiller at Bruichladdich when it relaunched itself onto the world. His final posting was at Ardnahoe. He had a hand in this, and lovely. Sweetly vanillic, creamy, supple, mouth-filling, beguiling dram, the 5-year-old, with lots of lithe fatness and weight to it. Really, I suppose, if the islandness of this particular dram is the presence in the mouth to me. It's not a particularly savage dram. It's not one there's a bit of peat lurking in there, but not very much. And it's the presence and the wealth in the mouth, really, that I think betrays its Islay origins. And then let's quickly taste the Bolsa too. This is the one that has the corrosive cask treatment. And lots of a more boisterous dram to smell for sure. One thing I like about this a lot is that it seems to have seaweed and marine tones, as well as the sweetness of the cask and as well as the peat quality that it has. I think that's always lovely to smell in a whiskey. Not quite sure, scientifically speaking, where that might come from, but one always hopes, because this is, I think, one way in which terroir might play a role is if you actually store all of your whiskey on site and do 100% of the aging on site on Islay, which has a very significant climate. It seems to me that must leave some kind of a stamp in the whiskey.
It certainly does, and one can even make the argument different parts of a warehouse can make an impression on that. Mr. Percy over at Beaumont and I hopped around barrels during my one time there, and that opened my eyes considerably to those aspects. Andrew, let's move on to the Ardbegs, if we could.
For sure. So we have the Ardbeg 10-year-old.
I remember a day when I could find, let alone afford, the 17-year-old. Those days are long gone.
Now, the interesting thing about the Ardbeg 10-year-old, one of the interesting things. There are many interesting things about it. The first of it is that you'll note it's actually a relatively pale color, and that tells you that it's uncolored. And it also tells you that it's using well-seasoned oak by and large, not a super young oak. But it might also be telling you something else, because one of the very significant things about the distillation process of Ardbeg is that it has a purifier on its spirit stills. And the effect of the purifier is, as it was described to me when I was researching the book, it's almost halfway to triple distillation, because a lot of the lighter alcohols travel through on the top part of the line arm, whereas the heavier alcohols, which are down at the bottom part of the line arm, get swept back and redistilled. Although Ardbeg technically is quite a peaty whiskey, the peat level of Ardbeg is 50 parts per million. So officially, it is the peatiest whiskey on the island in terms of its original peating level.
Indeed.
50 parts per million. It doesn't come across as a crashingly wild, unbridled peaty spirit. The peatiness is actually very subtle when you smell it. And altogether, it's for such a strong and a characterful and a powerful whiskey, it's very elegant and very refined. And that really, to me, is the hallmark of Ardbeg. And it's very clear in this 10-year-old, which is a beautiful whiskey. Peat tends to be either love it or hate it. And when you come to the most boisterously peaty whiskies, like Lefroy, for example, they tend to be love it or hate it whiskies. And indeed, they've used that as part of their marketing in the past. But Ardbeg is much less like that, because it is so elegant and so refined, withal the fact that it's so peaty and rich.
Fully agreed. Let's move on to the anthology of Ardbeg, The Unicorn's Tale, it's subtitled.
Okay.
Ooh.
Now, this is one that uses bourbon casks as well as Madeira casks. Honestly, I'm a little less keen on this than I am on the 10-year-old. I'll tell you why. It's because there's definitely a sulfur note to the nose of that, which I'm fairly sure is to do with the shipment of the Madeira cask through the distillery.
Certainly.
Because I've come across this quite often before when I've been tasting cask samples and so on. And when you take casks from some distance away and you need to get them all the way to Islay, they're often quite heavily sulfured before they travel.
Especially casks that once contained a sweet wine to help minimize the secondary
Indeed.
fermentations.
I know this to my cost because in the early days, Bruichladdich used to sell casks of whiskey. And I remember being told by the distillery team, oh, it's wonderful, we've got these Exi-Chem casks coming over. We're going to fill these Exi-Chem casks, Chateau d'Yquem, the greatest Sauternes of all. And I did actually buy one of those. And I managed to get one or two samples just to try before I ever had it bottled. And in the end, I sold it on because it did have precisely those sulfur problems. And I often wonder, in the end, he wouldn't do this with Chateau d'Yquem, but I wonder with Liz and Madeiras why they don't actually ship them fully filled with the original wine and then empty them on Islay and take the wine back, which is never the highest quality wine of all.
No.
I mean, often it's seasoning wine.
Of course.
And then you would avoid this kind of problem of a slight sulphury note being in the spirit. All of that said, it's not a complete blemish on this, and particularly once you taste the whiskey, it's had 14 years of age, so a lot more age to this whiskey.
It's certainly it's a bit more stronger in alcohol, and it's certainly more viscous in the mouth, darker in color. Though I would not call it dark. It's still, I would say, a tawny gold. And it is less, shall we say, less easily defined as an Islay whiskey, less clearly standing up and saying it's Ardbeg. I do believe that the Madeira cask had its perhaps desired for effect, but to me, it's it's losing the beat for my taste.
And we're also a bit spoiled, perhaps, by the Ardbeg 10-year-old, which is such a fantastic whiskey in any case.
Sure. To be fair,
on the palate, I'm enjoying this because it does have that density and that tight pack of flavor that Ardbeg always seems to have. And on the palate, you don't quite notice the sulfur to the same extent that you notice it on the nose. So it's more of a complexing factor on the palate. So I quite enjoy the palate as a dense, serious, savouring after-dinner whiskey in the glass. It's just on the nose, I'm a bit less convinced.
A little bit of damnation with faint praise of the anthology. Let's move along. We have samples from Beaumont and Lefroy to contend with.
Okay.
Where should we go next?
You've got a Beaumont.
I do. I have two.
You've got two. So
shall I continue then? All right. I have the 15-year-old.
Let's hear all about it. And Bowmore, in theory, is the golden mean of all the Islay distilleries. It has 25 parts per million. I'll quickly, while David's getting ready to give you his opinion on that, I'll quickly run you through all the traditional parts per million of all the big Islay distilleries. Traditionally, the non-peaty ones, the unpeated ones, were Bruichladdich and Bunnahabhain, of course, although both have peaty incarnations. The next least peatiest, as it were, was Bowmore with 25. Very interestingly, Lagavulin and Caol Ila are both exactly the same with 35. And I say very interestingly because they're completely different whiskies, which really illustrates the point that distillation processes and aging processes have a huge amount to do with the final flavor of whiskey. Then you have Laphroaig on 43 parts per million, and finally Ardbeg on 50. So Bowmore right in the middle, 25. And I always think it's a very happy medium. But David, tell us about it.
I'm with you there. Bowmore has always struck me as such. You described in your book that, and I'm quoting here full on, Percy, the aforementioned master distiller there, Percy battled through clawing brambles, ankle-twisting grasses, sucking bog rushes, an infuriation of tussocks. What is a tussock?
Tussock's like a big grassy clump that you trip over and hurt yourself.
I've done that. I've done that before here in the Hudson Valley. Thick gray willow copses and sickly sweet bracken banks. It reminded me of barrel hopping in its main warehouse with the Mr. McPherson. And as I said earlier, it's one of my career's greatest tutorials in taste differentiation. And I'm with you there on the Bowmore, should we say, hugging the delicious middle. One thing that's set Bowmore apart for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they, in my estimation, use a definable proportion of sherry casks in the aging of their whiskeys. So I say, putting a thumbprint upon Bowmore as compared to other Islay whiskeys. You can make arguments for Laphroaig being peat and seaweed, Lagavulin being peat and smoke, all these things. But for me, Bowmore is the very capable use of sherry casks in this aging.
And that sherry flavor goes so well with the mid-level peating too.
This 15-year-old is quite supple on entry, but towards the end, it brightens up. It screams, again, lots of the hedgerow characteristics that you poetically described in Whiskey Island that I just quoted. And it's got a more of a savory rather than a gentle finish. It's jumping up and a little bit almost prickly on the finish, but with that sherry, should we say, mature character reigning in it a little bit. This is how I'm experiencing this 15-year-old.
And by the way, the things you quoted from the book, those are all literally true of the distillery Lade. Percy and I were walking from the loch with the water in right down to the distillery, and it was easily the toughest of any of those walks because of all this mass of vegetation in between. I like the idea that it might, by some mysterious mechanism, waft its way into the whiskey.
My stroll in 2004 between Bowmore, where I was being hosted to sleep during my time there for Fèis Ìle, and I had my appointment at Bruichladdich, so I decided I'd walk the entire route. And when I did, I noticed that I was passing, before I got to the town of Bridgend, walking along the road, that the tide was out, pretty far out, as I'm looking across the Loch and Dal. And I cut across a good swath rather than stay on the road, and tramping across in my trench coat and boots across the sands. I received a phone call from my dear aunt in Chicago informing me that her mother, my grandma Rose, had gently passed on at the age of 92. So my memories of Islay are complicated with that remembrance. Once I arrived at Bruichladdich, I shared this information. I was a little bit starry-eyed thinking of my grandma, who I thought very dear. And Mark Rainier was very kind enough to say, whatever you want to taste, we'll taste in commemoration of her, and we did. This next thing I poured is also from Bowmore. It's their 15-year-old sherry cask, which to me is gilding the lily, but let's find out how it is. The sherry cask is even more pronounced on the nose than it was on the straight 15-year-old. And they say here that it's clocking in at 43%, whereas the standard 15 is at also 43%. Okay. Interesting. So I guess it just must have been more sherry exposure. That's a good amount of Oloroso sherry cask. I could tell the darker, more toffee prune notes on there than you'd find in an Amontillado or a Fino cask. A little bit richer on the palate than the standard 15-year-old. Little more viscosity, more density, which helps to blanket that brightness on the finish that I would attribute to the previous one, more of a, shall we say, cigar Bowmore than to soften the smoke later on. I can tell you what I've got planned afterwards. Andrew, let's please move on to Laphroaig's.
Laphroaig, okay, the Laphroaig I've got is a Laphroaig called Four Oak. This is a travel retail exclusive. I've had it for a wee while. It doesn't have an age statement, which probably means it's quite young, but it's matured in 4 different casks for a uniquely peat-smoked malt, it says. And I have to say, Laphroaig was the first ever Islay distillery I stepped into on that wild morning with Ian Henderson. And it is, for me, perhaps the most beautifully sighted of all from the outside, from walking around. I think from inside the still house, Fèis Ìle is hard to beat. But when you're walking around the warehouses, the Laphroaig's, it's called number 1 warehouse, it is right hard against the sea. The windows are all smeary with sea salt. Same thing for the distillery manager's office. So it's always the distillery for me, which I figure to be the most wild and storm-lashed of all of them. It's, of course, one of the 2 distilleries along with Bowmore that does its own malting on the island. Not a huge percentage of its malt nowadays. I think 15% of its own malt. Nonetheless, that's significant too. And it is one of the distilleries that does some of its own aging on the island. I don't know if all of the single malt is actually Islay aged or not, but I like to think this one is. It's obviously had quite a lot of sweet oak treatment, but in fact, for a whiskey as wild and boisterous as Laphroaig is in its extreme youth, this works quite well. And I have to say, almost, it's not often true that you can say that a whiskey you've had open for a while actually improves because it's slowly oxidizing. But I rather fancy that this has got a little better than when I first opened it. I remember it being very wild and confronting when I first opened it. And now, after a year or 2, it's settled down somewhat. And the oxygen seems to have smoothed it and given it extra harmony.
I'm glad to hear.
It's actually smelling very beautiful. You get a lovely combination of rich sweetness, cigar sweetness, tropical vegetation sweetness, luscious white flowers, gardenias, things like that, along with the lovely, nourishing, peaty smoke aromas. And then on the palate, a little cough there, because it's the one I forgot to put water in. Normally, I always have my whiskey watered. It took me by surprise, but lovely whiskey. Again, that perfect combination of the actual boisterousness, which is very typical of Laphroaig, and it's what they've distilled, what their stills are designed to produce, and the way they fill them very full. It's what that is designed to produce, and they have quite long cuts, and it's what that's designed to produce. So all of these things are feeding into that boisterous, rumbustious, wild character that Laphroaig has. I spoke about the storms, played warehouses, that's playing its role too. And then you get this lovely brocade of sweetness from the cask aging as well. So
indeed,
a delicious brown.
I poured myself a bit of the 10-year-old that's been provided. The Laphroaig 10-year-old is always a great go-to when I see it available at a bar. I will opt for it more than most any other whiskey, let alone spirit, when I'm traveling on the road. And I'm happy to have it here today. I did try the Four Oak once in duty-free. I concur with you, Andrew. It's a bit of a wild thing at first. I'm glad we can give some credence to the idea that spirits can actually sometimes improve with age, not just deteriorate in that. Lastly, I want to give an acknowledgement to the Elements L2.0 that I've received. It's a cask strength. It's nearly at 60% alcohol, and it's definitely showing more of a cask influence from the color. And a little bit on the nose. There's some more oak here than I would attribute to the standard 10-year-old Laphroaig. Again, the nose is not coming up as overly alcoholic. A bit of viscosity there, helping out the alcohol, which doesn't really creep in till much later on the finish. It's a sprightly thing. It's got some depth. This, too, might become a bit more cohesive with a little bit of time. I will certainly give it that. I don't know the whole story on this L2.0. It is a cask strength whiskey, again, for those who care to collect these sort of things. It looks to be quite an amazing attempt. What a long finish it's got going on here. Andrew, before we conclude, you finished the book 2 decades ago. How much has changed on Islay since? It sounds like it has, and there's more to come. Yeah, and its importance as a whiskey island certainly increasing. Your work, in small part, has contributed to that. So what do you expect in its future?
I think Islay has a very bright future, actually. The only sort of qualification one needs to make to that is that sometimes the islanders themselves are a little bit aghast at everything that's happened because the island has changed so much, so rapidly in such a short period of time. Number of distilleries doubling, number of visitors rocketing. It's great news for the island because nobody need want for a job on Islay. Lots and lots of work to be done. And that's great. But it does mean that it's not the place it was probably when I first went there in 1993. Whiskey finds its way quite discreetly into the glens and the hills, and the island itself, its physical being won't change, and there'll be still all those wonderful remote places like the O and the mountainous parts of Islay that will be completely unspoiled as ever they were. They're very sincere people. They're sometimes slightly shy, but they're very fierce and supportive friends once you have their confidence. And I'm looking forward to getting back as soon as I can because it's, in many ways, it's the place I dream about at night.
I look forward to hopefully joining you there in 2026's edition of Fèis Ìle. Andrew Jefford. Do check out Whiskey Galore. It's available in many countries through the usual means. Look for his book. Forward, by the way, there's a forward by Dave Broom, another noted whiskey writer. A really good forward by him, worth checking out as part of it. Go to andrewjefford.com. Check out his Wikipedia page as well. He's widely read and widely available to read on many different outlets. Andrew Jefford, thanks for drinking on the edge.
My pleasure. Good to be with you, David.